Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this legislation that contains the Corbett gas tax increase. Mr. Speaker, this legislation contains a tax increase that will be to the tune of $2 billion with other associated fine and fee increases, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the period of time that this will be implemented, consumers could see up to 28 cents more per gallon of gas at the pump, Mr. Speaker. According to the American Petroleum Institute, our taxes on gas per gallon currently stand around 50.7 cents per dollar. Adding that 28 cents, we're up around 79 cents per gallon, Mr. Speaker. This increase, once it's fully implemented, has potential to make us the highest in the country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, besides that, as my office looked through this legislation today and had some of my staff counting the fees and fine increases, they told me that they found over 130 fine and fee increases in this bill, Mr. Speaker. Increases such as the annual increase for registration of an ambulance, Mr. Speaker, from $54 to $77, a $23 increase, or pretty much a 50% increase there, Mr. Speaker, or close to it. Increase in the vanity plates from $20 to $76, or a $56 increase, Mr. Speaker. Increase in the issuance of a certificate of title from $22.50 to $50, more than a 100% increase, or 27.50 increase, Mr. Speaker. Annual registration of a messenger service from $50 to $192 fee, a $142 increase. Mr. Speaker, counties will now have, under this legislation, the abilities to assess a $5 vehicle registration fee for any vehicle that's registered to an address in that county. Another additional cost to the taxpayers of the Commonwealth, Mr. Speaker. And what happens to those businesses such as the trash collection companies and others that have a numerous number of vehicles that are being used? Of course, their costs are going up, and those costs will be passed on to the consumer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the legislation would funnel nearly $500 million a year in extra funding to mass transit. Both SEPTA and the Port Authority are already highly subsidized by the taxpayers of Pennsylvania, Mr. Speaker, while less than 5% of the Commonwealth's population actually use mass transit to commute for work, Mr. Speaker. SEPTA is subsidized by taxpayers to the tune of 60%, while the average route fare is only $1.95, and the Port Authority is subsidized to the tune of 70%, Mr. Speaker, by taxpayers. And they're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars, and we'll receive it through this legislation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's been plenty of other options on the table that colleagues have put out there to address the issue of funding for roads and bridges without a tax increase, Mr. Speaker, such as elimination of the Turnpike Commission and joining that together with PennDOT to create efficiencies, Mr. Speaker, prohibiting the State Transportation Commission from diverting any of Pennsylvania's allocation of federal funding that's dedicated for highways and bridges to the subsidizing of mass transit, as was done during the Rendell time in office, Mr. Speaker. Requiring DCNR to publicly auction at least 300,000 acres of state-owned land over 3 years for natural gas exploration and development, and use the royalties of that for infrastructure development improvement, Mr. Speaker. Taking funds from the sale of Pennsylvania's monopolized liquor control system and using that for improvement of our roads and bridges. Mr. Speaker, there's plenty of other ideas that could be utilized to address funding of roads and bridges in this state instead of a tax increase on the hardworking men and women of this state, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I received quite a few emails, actually, on this issue. The majority opposing. Thanks, Mike. Thank you. I said, thank you, Mike. I listened, this constituent wrote, I listened to Governor Corbett on KDK this morning, that was this morning, defending this new tax, which he called a fee. Ha! That's what she's writing. I understand that we need to improve and upkeep the infrastructure, but at what expense? Every time taxes are raised, and you know they will be passed on to the consumer no matter what he tries to say. That takes money out of the economy and into the hands of the government where it is wasted and misused. Government officials must learn to live within their means, just like the working, and she puts in parentheses, and I emphasize working, public. Cut the wasteful entitlement programs, the ones that promote a lifestyle of not getting off their duff, and find the money somewhere else. I am concerned for my kids' and grandkids' futures. That's written by one of my constituents, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we also received some letters from some business owners that will be impacted and wanted to share the results of this tax increase on their business and their consumers and taxpayers. This one was from Dandy Mini Marts, where they write, "Dear Representative, I'm writing to you on behalf of Williams Companies, which consists of Dandy Mini Marts Incorporated, Williams Oil Company Incorporated, and Williams Auto Group. Between our three companies, we employ approximately 1,400 people and serve the northern tier of Pennsylvania. The proposed fuel tax increase will have an incredible negative impact on our businesses, our consumers, and our employees. This additional taxation will affect our customers and our local economy, shouldering an additional tax burden of approximately $25 million, an impact no one in Pennsylvania can afford or should be forced to absorb. The Pennsylvania House of Representatives passed the House Bill number 106, Transportation Package, on November 19th after failing twice, and the Senate passed House Bill 1060. It is now going back to the House of Representatives. I urge you to oppose House Bill 1060. With this new bill, the PA fuel taxes will increase 28.5 cents on gas and 39.8 cents on diesel over 3 years starting in January 1st, 2014. We have no choice as retailers than to pass this increase in fuel tax to our consumers. We are projecting decreases of anywhere between 15% to 30% of our sales if this bill finally passes, reducing tax revenue to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The end result will have a crippling effect to many Pennsylvania industries and is a severe burden on every motorist traveling in Pennsylvania. If House Bill 1060 is finally passed, Pennsylvania will be the highest tax state in the country. Increasing the fuels tax is not the answer to the shortfall in funding, because raising the fuel taxes will only lead to unnecessary burden on Pennsylvania citizens with exorbitant fuel prices, reduced consumption, hence reducing tax revenue, motorists purchasing fuel in our neighboring states where taxes are much lower, trucking and warehousing companies moving operations out of Pennsylvania due to high costs of doing business in the state, causing loss of tax revenue and loss of jobs, loss of thousands of jobs at Pennsylvania gas stations, truck stops, restaurants, and ancillary businesses due to loss of business to neighboring states. Alternative solutions should be to increase the motor fuel tax over 10 years to allow this tax increase to be absorbed solely by Pennsylvania motorists, identify vehicles of industries that cause the most damage to our roads and implement a special tax, establish a severance tax on natural gas production as many states have currently placed. Thus, we urge you to oppose the House Bill 1060 transportation bill, sparing Pennsylvania's households and small business from higher fuel taxes and the potentially ruinous increases whose effects on our Pennsylvania travel industry will linger for years afterwards. Thank you for your consideration. Signed by the President of Dandy Mini Marts, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are also in receipt of another letter from JT Oil, who writes that they are a diesel fuel and gasoline retailer in Wayne County. Said they have great concern on the devastating negative effect the House Bill 1060 transportation will have on their industry and reduction of tax gallons in PA. They urge opposition to that. The Pennsylvania House of Representatives, he goes into it, passed it, and he urged us to oppose that bill. He said that with it, of course, it's going to increase the taxes, and they were projecting a drop of almost 35% of their sales if this bill passes finally, Mr. Speaker. And he went on to have some of the same points as the other letter also, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is coming from business owners that actually have to write business plans and project revenue for the next year and actually have to adjust their budgets throughout the year, unlike state government that does it once a year, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm in receipt of another email. This will be the last email that I'm going to read from someone down in the Pittsburgh area that wrote, "Please keep fighting this tax. I had a highway engineer, a fellow conservative, provide an explanation as to why we needed this tax. Basically, it was so his firm would continue to have highway contracts. I told him it was a conflict of interest for him to even mention. He used the example of those who drive on the roads should help pay for their upkeep. Well, those who use public transportation use the roads as well and should pay for their upkeep through higher fares. What we need is someone in office who will pay attention to how the existing funds are spent and cut wherever possible, just like I must do with my budget. And Mr. Speaker, this is coming from individuals that are going to be the recipients of this vote tonight and going to be on the receiving end of having to pay these higher taxes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I do have a question regarding the legislation, if the sponsor be willing to answer it.
Gentleman, Mr. Powell indicates he'll stand for interrogation. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on pages 26 and 27 of the bill, talks about the distribution of the money that's going to meet local matches. And it divides that up. Is that all of the mass transit funding, or is that a component of the mass transit funding?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, thank you for your question. What that is a match for local funds put up for construction projects. To give you an example, in Pittsburgh, not the North Shore connector, but the new bus terminal that's being built in Harmer. In Philadelphia for SEPTA, it would be repair of over 100 failing bridges used by both passenger car and SEPTA, Modium, buses, whatnot. Thank you for your question, Mr. Speaker.
Just to clarify, Mr. Speaker, so it's projects that the mass transit organizations are working on in their regions that might be a combined project that's also a road and bridge or tunnel type issue for that mass transit system.
You're correct, sir. It's called the Asset Improvement Program.
Mr. Speaker, is there any idea on how much money might flow through that? Because it divides it up into percentages, as far as SEPTA receiving 69.4% of the funds and the Port Authority receiving 22.6%. Other organizations receiving 8%, I believe, and then there's 5% it seemed that was going to be left over based on what's down in paragraph 4 of that section.
Thank you for your question, Mr. Speaker. Did you want me to break that down by individual mass transit system or as a whole?
Just the overall figure would be fine, Mr. Speaker.
Net asset improvements at the end of this program in 2018 will total approximately 1.16. Pardon me, I read the wrong number. It's 332 million, sir. 907 is the projection. 332 million over the course of the next several years. That plays out to the end of 2018, 2017, right. 2018 fiscal year. So approximately 300 million. A little bit over. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to resume comments related
Gentleman
to my
may
questions.
proceed on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, probably one of the largest concerns I have on page 27 is that it says in that section that the department shall set aside 5% of the funds available for distribution, and that those would be available at the discretion and distribution by the Secretary, Mr. Speaker. So out of $300 million, the 5% of that $300 million, which would be, what, about $15 million. So you'd have about $15 million that would be available to be used at the discretion of the Secretary, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I believe that as I've listened to our governor talk about eliminating the money that was available to legislatures in the form of WHAMs in the past, that this is a serious concern related to WHAMs of the future. I think that when you give any member of the governor's administration the discretion to spend millions of dollars, Mr. Speaker, at his discretion, that is a significant problem in that administrations can use that in a way to leverage the legislature to do what they'd like, and it ultimately would corrupt the process, Mr. Speaker. We've had past governors with their gubernatorial whams. This, to me, seems like a new wham being set up for this administration and future administrations through the use of these millions of dollars at their discretion, Mr. Speaker. No one man or woman in this body or in the governor's office should be making a sole decision at their discretion on how to spend millions of taxpayer dollars, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this legislation is bad for many reasons. It started off as a Title 75 bill, Mr. Speaker. Through the amendment of the Senate, it's been turned into a bill that's going to amend both Title 74 and Title 75, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think that really violates our constitutional charge to be within a single subject, Mr. Speaker. I think that if you're going to take a one-title bill, change it into a two-title bill, Mr. Speaker, I think that really violates the constitutional requirement for us to pass legislation that is single subject, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to make a motion because I don't believe that this body is going to be receptive to debating that motion at this time. We are debating House Bill 1060 and the concurrence of that, Mr. Speaker. But I do believe that this legislation is going to violate our constitutional responsibility to promote single-subject legislation, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just on the face of it, as the working public takes a look at what we're doing here, we took a couple-of-page bill dealing with a license plate, Mr. Speaker. And now it is this bill that's well over, it's 127 pages, that is a significant number of pages, like a small phone book, Mr. Speaker. And that's been turned into this bill that contains over 100 fees and fines and a $2 billion tax increase, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I urge non-concurrence. I urge a no vote on the Corbett gas tax increase, Mr. Speaker.